All right. Welcome back. A reminder, no class on Thursday. Have a lovely Passover, a joyous Easter, any other holidays, Ramadan, whatever you're celebrating. Have a good one. I will see you all after this one on a week from today. All right. Questions on your mind? No? All right. So I want to take a few moments to sort of recap where we've been. We've been talking about the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. And when we talk about the takings clause, the basic question is sort of which bucket, which category do you fall into? In certain cases, the government enacts a land use regulation that says you can't use your property in a certain way, or you have to use your property in a certain way. The government invariably argues that this is an exercise of the police power. When the government uses the exercise of the police power, there's no requirement to pay just compensation. That's bucket number one. The property owner will always argue that no, this is not an exercise of the police power. You've actually crossed the line. You've taken my property, and such a taking requires the payment of just compensation. All right, so you're generally going to be in either one or the two of these categories, or buckets as I call them. You either have an exercise of the police power, or you're going to have a taking of private property. All right, why does it matter? Money. The government never wants to pay, and the property owner never wants to not get paid, right? So there's always this inherent conflict. Now, there's some cases where it's an easy call to make. When the government uses eminent domain power to seize someone's property, there's Suzekilo, we want to take your property. That's clear. That's a taking, right? The government agrees that there's a taking. But what about a case like Penn Coal v. Mahon, where the government says you cannot mine for coal underneath a house or living structure? Government says, no, we're not taking, we're just regulating safety for the people who live there and for the miners. People with the subsurface rights say, yes, there is a taking. What about Hadachek, where the government says we're going to ban the baking of brick in certain districts? Government says we're just using our police power. Mr. Hadachek says, no way, you are taking my property. You enacted an unconstitutional statute. Right? So there are going to be all these conflicts between what the government says and what the property owner says. But at bottom, what we're trying to talk about is where do you fall? What category are you in? Are you using the police power, in which case you don't pay compensation, or are you using the taking power, in which case you do need to provide compensation? Everyone with me? So usually someone says at this point, Josh, okay, I get you, I'm listening to you. But how do I know if it's a taking or police power, right? How many of you are thinking that? That's probably like spinning in your head. No, I know. It's okay. It's fair. The short answer is that there's not a clear dividing line. In fact, there are going to be many tests we'll study to determine whether something's a taking. The clearest line I can give you so far is that when the government uses eminent domain to seize a house, there's a taking. That's not disputed. The trickier ones are cases where the government regulates property. So think of the cases we've studied so far. What at Village of Euclid v. Ambler, right? There, the government regulated land use. This zone was for residential, this zone was for industrial, and so on. And that diminished the value of the property by almost 80% in some cases. But there, the court said that's not a taking, it's not a violation of due process, it's land use regulations and the police power. We've had a check, right, where the government was trying to abate a nuisance. That is, the baking of brick was deemed a public nuisance, and the government tried to ban it. Again, the government said, that's fine, you can do that, no compensation required. But then we get to Penn Coal v. Mahon, which is sort of an outlier, where the government says you can't mine for coal underneath the house. What does the court say? Oh, no, that goes too far, right? Hadachek didn't go too far. Euclid didn't go too far. but apparently Penn went too far. Did the court explain why it went too far? No, it didn't. Thank you, Justice Holmes, right? The court didn't really give us a reason why. We can sort of guess at it, right? The value that the coal company had was to mine the coal. Right? That they didn't want the land just to sit there and look pretty. They had the land to mine the coal. And what was then the value of the coal underneath the house? Basically zero, right? Because if you can't extract the coal from the ground, it has no value. So maybe you could even say that in Penn coal, 100% of the value of the coal underneath the house was rendered worthless. It was all worthless, right? It had no value. So maybe that's why it went too far. Then we had a dissent in Penn coal from Justice Brandeis. And Justice Brandeis says, no, 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 you guys are looking at this all wrong. We can't just focus on the little number of coal pieces underneath the house. We need to focus on the bigger picture. The parcel as a whole, the whole parcel. You have coal there, you can mine. You have coal there, you can mine, right? You own all this other property where you can still mine. Justice Brandeis also explained that we have to think about the bigger picture. That when you ban the mining of coal, it's actually for the benefit of everyone. It improves worker safety. It promotes stability in the community, right? And Brandeis would probably say it actually helps the profitability of the company because who wants to mine coal underneath the house that could fall on you, right? It's actually good for the company. Now, whether you agree with that or not, I don't really care. That's Brandeis's argument. He said that there's a reciprocity of an advantage, right? There's reciprocal advantages. Everyone benefits when you regulate land in this fashion. Now, obviously, I think the coal company did not agree with that. They were unhappy with it. At least Brandeis made that point in his dissent. So then how do you know when a regulation goes too far? How do you know when a police power exercise goes too far and crosses a line into a taking? How do you know? That is the subject of our two cases for today, right? Penn Central and Loretto. Now, happens every year. Please, please, please do not confuse Pennsylvania coal with Pennsylvania Central. You will. Happens every year. I know it's going to happen because it's Penn C versus Penn C. It's the same damn thing, right? You think the Supreme Court have more creative names for cases, but that's what we have. So Penn coal involves coal mining. Penn Central involves the train station case. Okay? Good? Questions so far? All right. Where do I want to start? All right. Has anyone ever been to Grand Central Station in New York City? Oh wow, a lot of you. Okay, good. So I have some pictures which I can show you. There's some more in your book. It's a beautiful train station in Manhattan. If you compare it to Penn Station, Penn Station is an absolute dump. It's basically underground. It's dark. It's dreary. It's actually basically under Madison Square Garden, if you know where that is. But Grand Central Station is a beautiful terminal, high ceilings, lots of natural light. It's a very, very good place to be. If you ever see the Avengers movie, all right. So what in the movie is Stark Tower is actually the MetLife building. Oh, right. So the Grand Central Station is located in Midtown Manhattan. I'll just give you a sense of where it is. It used to be called the Pan Am building when Pan Am Airlines was big. You ever saw the movie The Aviator with Leonardo DiCaprio? Alec Baldwin played Juan Tripp. He was in the top floor, the CEO suite of Pan Am. The train station is located sort of on this strip where there used to be this very beautiful view going downtown of the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building and so on. But in the 1960s, the Pan Am building was built, now again the MetLife building. And this created a lot of concern among Manhattan elites. And by the way, this is on Park Avenue, a very elite area of town. I could never afford to live there. Neither could, well, maybe I shouldn't speak, but probably not you either, right? It's very expensive. Maybe you'll be big lawyers in a couple of years making millions, so you can live on Park Avenue. We'll see, right? But I'm priced out of that neighborhood. So a lot of people said we need to control what's built in New York City. So you have people like Jackie Kennedy and other celebrities come together and support what became the landmark law. And the purpose of the landmark law was a bit different than in the past, right? The law wasn't about designating certain neighborhoods as historical neighborhoods, right? Where it said everything on this block is historical. The law wasn't also about saying any new construction must look a certain way, right? Aesthetics. Instead, the purpose of the landmark law was to keep things the way they were, right? Whatever's there is now, that's what's going to be there, unless the government gives you some permission to change what you have. So this was a very novel law. This hadn't been really done before in other jurisdictions. Again, it wasn't about preserving historical districts or areas. The government would just pick specific buildings, 400 in total at the time. There are many more now. I have 1 million buildings in New York City. They would pick a couple hundred and say, we are deeming this a historical building with architectural significance, and you cannot change it in any meaningful way without our permission. Okay, we get the gist. Now, you can make changes if you get what's called a certificate, and there are a couple of ways of getting these certificates. One, if you need to make a change that would not affect any architectural features, you could. So I'll just give you an easy example, right? You have 30 Rock, right? Rockefeller Center. It used to be owned by GE. Now it's owned by Comcast. So they have to change the logo at the top from a GE logo to a Comcast logo, right? Doesn't sound very important, but it's a small change. So there's a permission to change sort of buildings that are minor. There's also a way you can change the building such that it does not affect the use of the landmark. So maybe one example might be some of the marble facade is crumbling from the Battle of New York, perhaps, right? And you need to replace in the marble. And the government will say, well, if you get the exact same kind of marble and you use the same style and it looks exactly the same, you can replace the marble, right? You want piece of marble falling on the street. So there's some ways of making changes that will be permitted. But that's not what the Penn Central Company had in mind. Okay. Anybody want to give me the facts in Penn Central? Anyone? Zach?
New York City enacted a law, the Act, allowing them to prevent alterations in specific buildings and districts with the city being historically significant. Penn Central Transport Company, owner of Penn Central Terminal, has been prevented by the Act from modifying the terminal, but now the company's.
How do they want to modify the terminal?
They wanted to add some additional structures on top of it, which the Act prevented.
Why did the Act prevent it?
Because the proposed reasoning, right, is because we're trying to preserve the historical nature of the architecture itself.
You seem skeptical of that rationale.
I
Well, you tell me what you think.
I think that a lot of very powerful people got very attached to the way New York made him feel and decided that they were going to make it stay that way forever.
Okay, right. Okay, that's an answer, right? Okay. So the developers for Penn Central put together two plans, Plan 1 and Plan 2. The first plan would have maintained the exterior of the train station, but the word is cantilevered. They use these kind of like inclined things. I don't know, architecture, whatever. They would have basically slapped a 50-story tower on top of the train station, right? That was option number 1, which would at least maintain the exterior. Option 2 is basically the F-it approach. They just tore down the entire front of the train station and they just built the tower as they wanted to. You say thumbs up to that one?
I like it.
Yeah, well, you like it.
I appreciate the evolution of architecture.
Okay, so we're not frozen forever in the 1890s? Okay. Thank you, Zach. So these are the two plans. Penn Central submitted them to the New York City board. Shocker, the board rejected it, right? So to absolutely no one's surprise. I think they called it a joke that they would even put together this proposal, right? Again, keep in mind, the company owned the air rights to build here, right? And the government said, you cannot use your air rights. Or did they? I want to drill down this point a little bit. Under the landmark law, there was this program known as a TDR, right? Transfer Development Rights. Did I get the acronym right? We always script this out. That's right acronym, right? Yeah. Yeah, the Transfer Development Rights, TDRs. And the way this works, it says, well, you know what? You can't use your air rights, but you can sell them. Huh? Why would anyone buy air rights? In New York City, not all land is zoned to go high, right? The city has very strict height limits on buildings. So if you're in an area where you want to build up high and your area doesn't allow it, what you can do is purchase these credits, these TDRs, from someone like Penn Central. And you can basically transfer their rights to yours, where you can't build on top of the train station because of the landmark law, but in your neighborhood, there's nothing barring it. There's just a zoning code. So in theory, at least, New York City didn't actually eliminate the air rights. They simply said you can use it somewhere else. And the facts of the case suggest that the owner, Penn Central, owned a number of properties nearby, the Biltmore Hotel and otherwise, and that the Penn Central company could have used these air rights elsewhere, sold them. Now, we have the benefit of hindsight here. As it turns out, it took almost 50 years to transfer these development rights. The TDRs were not transferred to the year 2015. This case was 1978. So we're talking almost half a century here, right? And they were eventually sold for at $1 billion, as billion with a B, so a substantial amount. But Penn Central went out of business. They went bankrupt very quickly after this case. So perhaps one of their biggest assets that could have kept them solvent was basically locked up in this TDR program. Right? So I want to focus on this point about the TDRs for a minute, right? We have Penn Coal, and Penn Coal says when the subsurface rights are diminished in value to 100%, right? You have no value from the coal. That goes too far. Here, the air rights were diminished. Were the air rights diminished 100%? If you ask Penn Central, they'd say, yes, it was. If you ask the city of New York, they say, well, no, it's not, because they can then transfer or sell those air rights to someone else. So it's not 100%. So one way of thinking about this case, which agree, disagree, it's fine, is you ask, does a regulation go too far? Does a regulation go too far? The TDRs are actually an important part of the court's decision to say that no, it did not go too far, because there's still some value to be had. Now, in fairness to the train company, they had these air rights which said we can build here. There's no zoning law restricting it. And those air rights were taken away from us. Maybe they didn't want to transfer. Maybe they wanted the real estate right there. Casey? I love this question. I always get this question. Do you think, and you're a bright guy, right? Do you think if they proposed something small, it would have gotten approved? We don't know. I can tell you. The answer is absolutely not. No, not a chance in hell. Jackie Kennedy would come out there and she would have just stopped it, right? Maybe she was an ass by this point, right? There's no chance. Someone funny asking the same seats right there, asking this question before in the other class. No chance in hell they'd approve anything. This train station was considered sacrosanct, right? They were not going to approve any changes. But Justice Brennan does fault them for not going through the court system, not going through the process of resubmitting. This reminds me of the case. It wasn't in your book, but I signed it. They wanted to build it was a hardware store in Washington State somewhere, and they submitted one plan, and they submitted another plan, and they submitted a third plan. Saying, oh, that's not it. Go back to the drawing board. So you can imagine how frustrating, expensive this process might be when you're trying to run a commercial entity and get financing and loans, all this other stuff. You can't hold stuff up indefinitely. So the city, I'm sorry, the train company didn't litigate this through the courts. Instead, they didn't try and litigate whether the denial of the certificate was valid. Instead, they went and they challenged the entire landmark law on its face. It was a facial challenge, arguing that's unconstitutional. Now, maybe Casey's right. Maybe he's right, And maybe if they had gone back and they put a 25-story tower, we've gotten approved. I say not a chance. There's no way, especially since I mentioned Penn Station. Penn Station used to be a beautiful train station. It was demolished in the 50s to build Madison Square Garden, right? The new Madison Square Garden. Everyone had that in their minds. They did not want this train station to be changed at all. In fact, to this day, people want to demolish Madison Square Garden Arena to rebuild Penn Station. To this day, they still do. There's just never-ending debate about why Penn Station is so ugly. Anyway, okay. All right. So everyone with me so far? All right. So the case goes to the Supreme Court, and we have to then deal with some precedent, right? The majority opinion was by Justice Brennan. Maybe you like him, maybe you don't. But one thing that Justice Brennan was very good at was not laying down clear rules. He did not like clear rules. He did not like bright lines. He liked everything to be very fuzzy, to give judges as much discretion as humanly possible. But when you're laying down fuzzy tests, you can still sort of put a thumb on the scale. And I think you'll see, and maybe you'll believe me or not, that this test means the government wins. Right? The upshot of the Penn Central test is the government wins, and the government wins. That's the upshot of this test. All right. So Justice Brennan walks through precedent. And he says, look, the mere fact that Penn Central is losing money, that's not enough to create a taking. That is not enough. And he gives a couple examples. Check, right? That was the case with the Brickyard. When the government finds a nuisance or a noxious use, they can prohibit it, even though the value of the land was dropped by 90%. But wait a minute, was there a nuisance in New York City? Did anyone allege that this structure would be a nuisance? No, of course not. So it's not really relevant, but it's Brennan. Okay. The second case he cites is Penn Coal v. Mahon, the coal company case. And in that case, there was a substantial diminution in value of the land, but they found a taking. Right? So how does Justice Brennan deal with Penn Coal? It's very crafty the way he does this. He says, we will follow the test of Justice Holmes. We will say, if a regulation goes too far, it'll be a taking. But how do you then define whether something goes too far? Here's what Brennan does. It's very crafty. He adopts the Brandeis dissent, which focuses on the parcel as a whole. Right? So think about it. You have a train station. You have tunnels underground. You have all these stores and restaurants and shops at the surface level, and then you have the air rights. If you focus entirely on the air rights, then the value is diminished arguably 100%. But if you also focus on the surface rights, where the train station is, and the subsurface rights, where the trains and tunnels and other things are, there's still value. So it depends what you make the denominator. If the denominator is just the air rights that's being regulated, then yeah, Penn Central probably wins. But if you say that there's still value to be had from the property by the surface and subsurface rights, you didn't go too far. And I think Brennan goes even further. He seems to suggest that because the TDRs can be transferred to other properties owned by Penn Central, the denominator is even bigger. It's not just the train stations, all the adjacent properties, right? So the theory here is that because there's value to be had elsewhere, there's not a taking. That they're taking only they're regulating a very small portion, right? Also, there's benefits to keeping the air rights open. There might be more tourism. People in the community will be happier. There'll be more air, more sunlight, more fresh air to breathe, and so on. So what Brennan basically says is you cannot focus exclusively on the thing that's being regulated. You have to focus on the entire picture, the big picture, everything really. And let me tell you this, when you make the denominator that big, a regulation will never go too far, right? If you have the denominator that large to include the entire city and the well-being of the people, there was never going to be a taking, which is exactly what Brennan decided, right? He crafted this test of the parcel as a whole such that there's always going to be a return on value and there will never be a taking. Okay? Everyone with me? Okay. The third case that Brennan cites is Village of Euclid, which again had a substantial diminution in value of property. But also, Village of Euclid was land that was not yet built upon, right? It wasn't saying that you can't keep what you already have, and you can't build new stuff. We have this concept of grandfathering. Whereas with the Penn Central case, they had this tower, they'd already invested all this money in it, and they want to expand upon it. So they were basically stopping an improvement on an already existing usage. The fourth case is a weird case, which doesn't really fit anywhere, which involves chickens and airplanes. United States versus Cosby. This is not like Bill Cosby. That'll be a different U.S. case. This is CAUSBY, 1946. And the facts are kind of weird. There was a chicken farm. Airplanes would fly over the chicken farm and scare the chickens. And the chicken farmer owned a suit for a taking against the government, and they found there was a taking.
To be clear, it was not merely agitating the chickens, it was literally killing. Chickens are actually super fragile, will have noise.
So yeah, well, the chickens were dying. The question, are you chicken? Yeah, I mean, yeah. Cluck, 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 right? But the court found a taking there. This is a weird case, doesn't really fit anywhere. And Justice Brendan basically says, yeah, whatever, that was chickens, right? He hasn't put much weight in that case. But he really likes Euclid and he really likes Penn with a Brandeis dissent. Next, Brendan explains that there is no set formula to determine when there is a taking, right? There is no set formula to determine when there is a taking. Instead, what do we get? God love him. Ad hoc factual inquiries. Don't you guys love those as law students? Ad hoc factual inquiries, right? Where every case is decided by itself, right? He does not want to lay down any sort of rigid per se rules. In contrast, the next case we have, Loretto does have a rigid per se rule, sort of. But at least in Penn Central, the court says no. All right, next, Justice Brennan lays down 3 factors. And these factors are kind of important. He doesn't tell you why they're important or how they're important, where they come from. There are 3 factors. What the court did in the 70s, they just list factors and have you deal with like the Lemon test and so on. Factors, people love factors. All right, so let me walk through these one at a time. The first factor considers the economic impact of the regulation. The economic impact of the regulation. All right. This is more or less asking the diminution in value, right? To what extent is the value of the property being diminished? Is it being diminished 75%, 90%, 99%, or so on? You might think that this is a very important factor, but it's really not, right? If you get a 90% diminution in value, and that's fine, the first factor doesn't really do anything. It's kind of useless, right? The second factor is sort of the most important, at least in this case, even though the court doesn't talk about it. And let me just read this to you verbatim, and that way you can have it clear in your notes. The extent to which the regulation has interfered with distinct investment-backed expectations. I'll say it again. The extent to which the regulation has interfered with distinct investment-backed expectations. What on earth does that mean? Think of it this way. Think in terms of maybe a detrimental reliance claim, right? That if you did something, you relied on some promise, and you spent money, you invested, and then you got burned, right? You turned out you couldn't build it. Under principles of estoppel, the court might actually enforce the promise if there's a breach. It's a similar idea. Distinct investment-backed expectations. Did you have plans to build here? Well, yeah, everyone has plans. But were those plans backed by money? Right? It's not enough to have plans at what you want to build. Did money back up those plans? So here, look, blueprints. I'm sure they paid some architect a lot of money to make these blueprints. That's not enough. Not enough to just plan. You actually need to have a bulldozer, a cement truck, right? A shovel. You need to actually do something on the property to show that your expectations were backed by investments. And okay, Josh, that's easy, right? Zach?
And that you need to start the project before getting it disapproved.
You're actually on the right track, but you don't even know it. It's not even a matter of waste, it's a trap, right? It's like Star Wars. It's a trap. In New York City, you can't build, you can't pick up a shovel until you have a permit to build. And the government will not give you a permit to build because you're changing your property. It is impossible to have distinct investment-backed expectations, right? Because you can't get the damn permit if the government told you can't build. So it's a trap, right? Brennan is brilliant in this regard. He made a standard that almost is never satisfied. I'll tell you when it can be satisfied. But if you're trying to do something new and the government says, no, you can't do it, you will never be able to have those expectations backed by investments. Doesn't matter if you have financing lined up, a mortgage, and so on. They're not investment-backed expectations. Yeah, gee.
I'm just curious, since 9/11 disasters happened.
I mean, how long did it take to actually build a Freedom Tower? And it took almost a decade, right? That took forever, and lots of people were not happy with what was built. In New York City, building is by how do I put this? It's by community decision. You don't get to build what you want, right? Basically, every board has people who object, and then you have to go back and forth, and it's an insane process, right? But the point I want to stress here is that the way to get distinct investment-backed expectations is to start building, and you cannot start building unless you have the permit, and you don't get the permit unless you have the DIBs. Oh, by the way, distinct investment-backed expectations, DIBE, right? Often called DIBs, DIBE. I'll call them that sometimes if you want. But the way to get your DIBs is to invest money and to actually break ground, but you can't do that without a permit. So it's a trap, right? So the second factor basically means you lose, right? Heads I lose, tails you win, as it were. Right? And where did this come from? Maybe it came from a law review article. We don't really know for sure. It was Brennan, right? Details were never very important. But the court constructed a standard that makes it very hard to it. Now, let's say you already have something, right? You started building something, started constructing something, and you already broke ground. And the government says, oh, no, you have to stop, right? You have to stop building. In that case, I think you can have your divvies, right? Because you already started to build and you have some sort of a reliance interest, if you want to call it that. So the only way that the second factor can be satisfied is if there's something that's ongoing, they've already started, and the government tries to order you to stop doing it. Nick?
Oh no.
That's fine. All right, everyone see the problem with the second factor, right? It's very hard to satisfy land new construction. In other words, you need to basically have spent money on doing something that would be otherwise illegal. So to Zach's point about waste, you don't even get to waste, right? You can't even lift a shovel in Manhattan unless the government gives you permission, right? You can't do anything. I'm slightly exaggerating, but not by much. Okay, we're going to the second factor. All right. Brennan then lists a third factor. And this one's a little bit tricky because it doesn't explain anything about it, or not much at least. The third factor is called the character of the governmental action. In other words, what exactly is the government doing? Are they demolishing your house with a bulldozer? Oh yeah, that's probably a bit too much. Is there a physical invasion? The language Brennan uses. That might be too much. But in most cases, Brennan says the government is just adjusting the benefits and burdens of economic life. Isn't that nice? Adjusting the benefits and burdens of economic life. I see burden falling on the Penn Central Company. They're getting the burden. I'm not sure what benefits they're getting, but maybe I'm missing it. So you have these three factors, right? The economic impact, the DIBs, and the character of the government action. Now, I'll give you a preview. In our next case, Loretto versus Teleprompter, the court focused on the third factor extensively. One second. And the court distinguished how to define the character of the action. Yes.
So is it looking like in general to public economics?
Everything.
Like,
This is not just parcel as a whole. This is the entire island of Manhattan, right? Basically, any tourist who might ever wander across Penn Grand Central Station say, "Well, that's very pretty." That's part of it, also, right? It's everything's considered. All right, everyone get those three factors. And I don't like calling them factors. It's not like it's like all three are relevant, right? In this case, the court talks about none of those factors. They don't even matter, right? Brennan just sort of puts this stuff out and says, "All right, you guys deal with it later, right? Lower courts there on your own." Right. So let's just walk through the case, as it were, right? So first, Brennan uses the sort of parcel to whole approach. He looks at the entirety of not just the air rights, but the property, the adjacent properties, everything uptown, downtown, midtown, everywhere in between. Okay. I don't know that this is consistent with Penn Cole. Seems a lot like the Penn Cole dissent, but there you have it. Justice Rehnquist in dissent said that we can't do this parcel to whole analysis, right? There's no obligation for Penn Central to sell their transfer rights, and there's no obligation to keep the height of the terminal forever the same. I think Zach made a similar point earlier. Architecture can change and evolve, but the landmark law basically freezes things the way that were. I remember, right? If you watch South Park, nostalgia is a very powerful drug, and people like things the way they were. And most of modern zoning law is saying keep things the way they were because obviously things are better in the past. They can't ever get better in the future. I don't know. Okay. Next, they go to the issue of the taking, right? Is there actually a taken? Penn Central argued that they were singled out for disparate treatment, right? This wasn't a law that was applied across the board. And they're probably right about this, right? Because they targeted them specifically because they're right by the Pan Am building. Brennan rejects this claim and says that no, this law improves the quality of life in general. Even if you can build a tall tower across the street by transferring the credits, it still somehow improves the economic value for everyone. Okay. Finally, we get to the issue of just compensation. Were the TDRs, these transfer development rights, just compensation? New York made that argument. They said, okay, let's assume that there's a taking. We're providing compensation because you could transfer these credits. But wait a minute. Usually compensation comes from the government. The government pays you. Here, the compensation is not coming from the government. It's coming from private parties who may or may not agree to an arm's length transaction. So the government's trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're saying, oh yeah, we'll give you compensation from someone else's pocket, not from the taxpayer's dollar. It's ingenious, right? I mean, the people who were actually the lawyer who argued this case, I don't remember his name. He was actually one of the guys who drafted the law, so he knew this law very well. You go look on and you see his arguments. But they knew exactly what they were doing. It's similar to the Loretto case where they had the $1 compensation as backup. Like, oh, if there's a taking, fine, you get $1. So New York isn't stupid, right? They knew this was a challenge, and they sort of backed up their case with the possibility that you have this sort of compensation for the TDRs. Justice Brennan didn't actually decide if the TDRs were compensation. He didn't need to because he found there was no taking. We know now in hindsight that it took almost 50 years to offload these TDRs. And Penn Central basically went out of business, and there were many successive owners. It took a very long time. If you ever go to Grand Central Station, there's this very tall, skinny tower. That's a new thing in New York. These very skinny towers are like basically 1 or 2 rooms across that go up 100 stories. And it's called One Vanderbilt. You can see it. Sorry, I'll put a picture of it. Actually, only opened up. Yeah. Yeah, it's a super. Yeah, it's a super skinny tower, and this was used with the air rights to buy Grand Central Station. Anyway, that's what they got. What's that? I think it's hold on, what's the address? I think it's no, it's right next to Grand Central Station. Yeah, it's on 42nd Vanderbilt. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, there you have it. I'm just putting on map, see where it is. So you see how close to the train station. So in other words, right. So it's literally across the street from Grand Central Station. So you have this massive tower, right? So there's the train station. Yeah, this is Grand Central Station right here, and immediately next door is this ginormous tower. So and there's the MetLife building as well. So you have this need to have peace and order and harmony, and there's a huge tower right next door. So there you go. All right. So any questions on Penn Central? Again, yeah, go ahead.
And then one of the it's not the first few factors as you listed them, but it also gives you 4 more factors. So those extra 4 speak to the third.
Kind of, yeah. Hang with me. Hang with me. I'll get you there, I promise. Justice Brennan doesn't actually list these factors out the way I did. If you noticed. His opinions are notoriously vague and sort of designed to not lay down any clear rules. In fact, a lot of what Brennan wrote would not become clear until later in the process, until later cases. Right. But the important ones for you to remember are the dibbies, right? That's really where a lot of this comes down. And with the Brennan test, you're going to lose. If you actually get to Penn Central land, you're going to lose. Sorry. Nice knowing you. You're going to lose. Okay, can we move on? All right. The second case was decided also in New York, sensing a pattern, right? We're moving on from New Jersey to New York for takings law in 1982, called Loretto versus Teleprompter Manhattan CATV Corp. CATV, if you don't know, is cable television. Yeah? Yeah. Give me the facts. Go for it. I'm so happy you volunteered. It's good. You like this case?
I do because I've always had a pretty big interest ever since like 40 towers run out of the when they run and all that stuff.
Good. Go for it.
But Loretto basically filed suit. She bought a building. Before she bought the building, Teleprompter had installed a silver boxes of paving that go on her property, but they don't actually provide paving to the tenants of that property. And then prior to 1973, they basically had to get authorization, and then New York enacted a statute, and that statute basically gave them permission to do for paving that they need to do at this spot on local benefit, and then that's when the holiday came from. 2 years after she had bought the building, they actually installed a non-crossover line, and that was giving cable to the residents of her building as well. Which she thought too, because she said that basically that wasn't okay because it diminished the value of those offices.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. All right, so let me just give some background. Why is it called cable TV? I mean, the answer seems so obvious, but it was a signal delivered on a cable, right? Now, back in the 70s, when this technology started to come onto the market, cable companies faced a problem. Every house already had phone cables, right? And the telephone company would bring telephone cables into the house. They had these poles in every block. But the telephone companies didn't want to share their lines with the cable companies. There was competition, right? They were afraid that people start getting telephone service by, TV or whatever, right? They didn't know what the hell they were doing, right? I mean, one of the reasons why cell service was punished was because the phone companies didn't want a competition, right? So the cable companies got creative. In a place like Manhattan, buildings are very close to each other. So this idea, we will put cables that crossed over from one building to the next, to the next, to the next, basically building a highway in the sky of cables. So you have these crossover cables that go from one building to the next, to the next. And then what you have is called a drop down or non-crossover cable. They went down the side of the building and drilled into individual units. So if someone wanted, cable TV in their apartment, they would go down from the roof and then drill into their apartment. Today, almost every building has cable wired into the building. It's inside the walls. You don't even see it. It's under the ground and so on. This was a novel technology. So originally, Teleprompter made a deal with a number of businesses or residential properties in Manhattan. Let us put these cables in your building. We'll give you money and also share of revenue. And Loretto's predecessor said, yeah, okay, I'll go along with this. Loretto bought the building. It's not clear if she was aware these cables were there or about this deal. I mean, she probably knew these were visible from the street. It's not like they're hidden or latent, but whatever. And then she discovered this, and she didn't like it. Then New York enacts a law. And the law says residential properties are required to accept these crossover cables, and you get the lovely fee of $1 to compensate you for whatever injuries you may suffer. Again, there's cables. It was about 30 foot in length on the ceiling, on the roof, and about a ½ inch diameter. So these are very small. You have these sort of boxes where the cables were connected through, and then you had cables going down the side of the building, and they were installed with hammer and nail kind of into the mortar, into the masonry. Okay. Loretto files a class action on behalf of similarly situated property owners, and she argues that the building, that the cable law is a taking without compensation. All right. So before we actually get to the merits, let's assume there's a taking for a minute, which there was. Is the $1 payment just compensation? How do you measure just compensation? So in one regard, these are very small cables. They're barely visible from the street. But again, there are hammers and nails and drills into the side of the masonry, which is permanent, sort of permanent at least. How do you quantify the value of having these cables, which Loretto thought were ugly, on the side of her building? Right. Another related concern is the value to the tenants. Right. In theory, at least, this provides a value to tenants who want cable TV, be able to watch whatever is on the news. Right. So when you're measuring the just compensation, do you actually factor in the value given to your tenants in the building? If she turned into, say, commercial, she would not be required to install these cables, only for residential. All right. All right. So let's move on. The case goes to the Supreme Court. Vote was 6-3. Brennan, who wrote the majority in Penn Central, is in dissent. He joined the dissent by Justice Blackmun. Thank God, no relation, right? So you have a dissent Brennan, you have White, and you have Blackmun. And you have in the majority that right-wing flamethrower Thurgood Marshall writing the majority opinion, right? So for whatever reason, this is one of the rare cases where Brennan and Marshall went opposite directions. Usually they were like two peas in a pod, right? They voted together in all these cases. We don't know why, but I think Marshall, was very upset because you have this sort of physical intrusion onto the property, and that sort of comes through in his opinion. All right. Both the majority and the dissent sort of went along with the Penn Central framework, but they disagreed on the third factor, or at least what I call the third factor. People, by the way, I actually had extensive arguments on whether there's 3 or 4 factors. I'm going with 3. The book says 4, good for them. I go with 3. I spent hours on this exact question last year. I'm going with 3. That's my answer. By the way, I don't know if you had any paying attention to the Disney issue in Florida. There's a rule against perpetuities this year, I swear. I know, Zach, you ready for this? Right. So you may have seen that the governor of Florida tried to establish this board to take away power from Disney. Disney was basically a self-governing entity, Disney World in Orlando. It's called the Reedy Creek Development Corporation. And the governor tried to basically take power from this board. And apparently the board held a number of meetings that were open to the public, which no one attended, in which they created these various covenants and restrictions that give benefits to Disney that cannot be breached. And they put in for the duration of the covenant, I'm not joking, you saw this? Until the last living relative of King Charles III dies. They're dealing with rap, which would be, I think, one of, Williams's kids or Harry's, whichever one's younger, right? So basically, they put in a covenant that will exist for 100 years, right? These kids are in their toddlers, right? And now the Florida governor's not happy, but it's basically a rap issue. So I sent this to the editors of the case book. It'll be in the next edition. So rap still exists. It still matters. Rap matters. Anyway, going back, the Loretto court focuses almost entirely on the third factor. Because I think that the first factor, what's the economic impact of having super low cable there? Does that actually affect the resale value of the house? Maybe, probably not very much. I think Zach's right. If anything, it gives more value to tenants. And what about the second factor, the distinct investment-backed expectations? What's kind of weird here is that the predecessor of Loretto agreed to have this cable installed. So there's nothing new, right? The cable's already there. I don't know what the dibbies are, right? If anything, the dibbies go in the other direction. So basically, the court ignores the first two factors. They don't matter, which is why I hate the Penn Central test. And they focus exclusively on the third factor, which is the character of the governmental action. The character of the governmental action. And the court draws a distinction, two types of governmental actions. So I'm going to type these out and you'll follow them. The first is what they call a temporary physical invasion. A temporary physical invasion. Okay, that's number one. Number two is called a permanent physical occupation. A permanent physical occupation. Right? What Justice Marshall is trying to do was to put some meat on the bones of factor number three, right? To sort of identify what factor three can look like. And he does it based on time, the duration of the regulation. Is it temporary or is it permanent? And he uses these sort of funny words which make no sense, but is it a temporary invasion? Think of like an invading army that comes in just for a little bit. Right? They're not going to stay around. They just come for a little bit, do their business, and leave. Like your friend who comes by and leaves. And then you have something permanent, which is an occupation, which I guess is you're around forever. If it's temporary, one set of rules applies. If it's permanent, another set of rules applies. Unfortunately, my friends, you need to memorize these terms. They're not sort of easy to remember, but I'll try my best to teach them to you. Okay, so what happens if we have a temporary physical invasion? If the invasion is temporary, you know what we do? We balance. We consider all three of the Penn Central factors, right? That if there's a temporary physical invasion, we consider all of the Penn Central factors. Justice Marshall wrote that when you have a temporary invasion, you're just adjusting the benefits and burdens of economic life. This is how Brennan described the third factor, right? When it's temporary, you're just adjusting the benefits and burdens. What about the second category? What if there's a permanent physical occupation? If there's a permanent physical occupation, we do not engage in balancing. I'll say it again. If there's a permanent physical occupation, we do not engage in a balancing test. There's a bright line rule, right? If there's a permanent physical occupation, it's a taking. 100%. I mean, I should say 100%. 99%. If there's a permanent physical occupation, there's a taking. You don't consider the dibbies. You don't consider the economic impact. Even if the economic impact in this case is very trivial, a small cable, and even if there are no dibbies, it doesn't matter. What Justice Marshall did was to create a bright line rule for permanent physical occupations. There's a taking. And you do not consider the other two Penn Central factors. So you're seeing, I know you guys want like flow charts. I'll give you a flow chart in a couple minutes, right? But when you get to the third factor of Penn Central, you might actually want to do this one first, right? And you ask yourself, This is why the question, the number is actually not very important because it's Brennan, right? But when you get to this sort of this factor about the character of the action, if it's permanent, physical, occupation, bright line rule, you got to take and you got to pay up. If it's temporary, you go to the three factors. Now, someone asks, wait, Josh, wasn't the regulation of the air rights permanent? Right? Wouldn't that be permanent? Well, keep in mind, what does occupation mean? And I'll give you a very easy example of what occupation means. If there is a hammer and nail involved, there's an occupation. Right? If you have to bolt something into the wall with a hammer and a nail, there's an occupation. The word occupation does not just mean regulation. You can't use your air rights. No, no, no. Occupation means something is physically installed, drilled into a wall. So you can see how actually rare this is. Give you an example of flooding, right? Let's say after Hurricane Harvey, the government releases water from a dam and they flood your house for 2 weeks. Is that permanent or is it temporary? There's actually some litigation about this of how long something must be to be temporary. Right? If your house was flooded, such as permanently destroyed, the woodwork was just gone, is that a permanent taking? There's litigation about whether something's permanent or temporary. But the easiest rule is if something's installed like a cable on the side of a building, that's going to be a permanent physical occupation. Now, is it actually permanent though, right? Nothing's forever, not even diamonds, right? Nothing lasts forever. But at least under the law in existence, the law would say they're in effect indefinitely.
Takes issue with this entire decision, but particularly he brings up the problem of fire.
I will get there in a few minutes, I promise.
Oh,
I promise I'll get there. Yeah, no, I promise. If I don't get to you can yell at me later, right? So again, Penn Central said we do not have a bright line rule. We have ad hoc multi-factor balancing tests. And what does Loretto say? Yeah, we got a bright line rule if there's a permanent physical occupation. So Justice Blackmun, I'll get to in a few moments, again, no relation, says there's no set formula to determine where the regulation ends and takings begin. And he says any intelligible inquiry must ask about the extent of the interference and what are the alternate uses of the property, right? And in a way, it's kind of unfair that you have Penn Central, which had this massive air rights and they lost, and Loretto has this little stupid cable on the side and she won. Right? So there's almost like this weird perverse aspect where litigants are always saying, oh, I know I'm going to win. I don't want to go to Penn Central land. I want to stay here. It'll be permanent physical occupation. Because when you're in permanent land, you don't do Penn Central balancing. And the government says, oh, no, 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 we're just temporary. We're just here for a little bit. If your friend's sitting on the couch, we'll leave next week, right? Because then once you go temporary, you go into Penn Central land and you balance away for the government to win. So again, there's always litigation about what test they're using. Are you going to be using the Loretto bright line rule for permanent occupations? Or are you going to be using the Penn Central test, multi-factor balancing? Right, that's where a lot of the litigation is. So this issue with the flooding and Hurricane Harvey, Loretto actually plays a substantial role. Yeah, Zach? I'm used to it.
Here's on a theoretical basis. If you ever had an argument as to the Third Amendment, you think that it would be based off of this kind of Loretto language? Contemporary versus permanent.
So the Third Amendment, if you don't remember, is about quartering of troops. And I don't think there would be a taking because an amendment expressly allows it during times of war. But if there was this actually issue arose during one of the national disasters where some National Guardsman basically told someone, I need to stay in your house right now. You don't have a choice. Kind of like a safe harbor doctrine case. And they brought a Third Amendment claim. I don't remember exactly how that one shook out. But I don't know. It's weird. Yeah, I think pretty much if a government official's on your couch for a little bit, you can probably bring a Third Amendment claim if he forces himself there. There's also issue comes up. It was a state case where you had a drug unit, the police, and they were surveilling a property for some drug deal, and they basically demanded access to a guy's house to surveil, to watch a drug transaction. And the court actually held the Third Amendment was unincorporated, so it didn't restrict the state police. Anyway, so not important. All right, everyone with me? All right. Justice Blackmun again saying, wait a minute, didn't we just say in Penn Central that there's no bright line rules? So there's a shift, right? And for whatever reason, Justice Marshall wanted a bright line rule when there's a physical occupation, when there's a hammer and nail involved, and you're drilling screws into masonry. There are a lot of cases involving flooding from the 1900s, in which the flooding, even that wasn't forever, was still considered a taking. Justice Blackmun says these are archaic cases. We have a modern age. We don't care about these precedents, right? Which is a very Blackmun thing to say, I suppose. All right. So based on the character of New York's law, the court found that the cable was a taking. There was a direct physical attachment of plates, boxes, wires, bolts, screws to the building. And the insulation completely occupied the space on the wall. And think of it this way, Loretto could not do anything else on that spot. Like, she wants to put Christmas lights there, she couldn't, right? She couldn't do anything on top of those cables that could diminish them. Did she actually want to do anything there? Probably not. But at least in theory, she couldn't use it. And we speak of the bundle of rights, which the court actually alludes to. And we have this right to exclude. And the court seems to say that this regime diminishes the stick of the right to exclude. Now, Justice Marshall comes back and says, you guys, this is such a trivial diminution in value, right? Parcel is the whole. This is not going to diminish in value. Maybe it might even increase it. And Justice Marshall responds, doesn't matter. When we're in a bright line rule, we don't care how large the diminution value is. We don't balance anything. It's a bright line rule. So again, if you're a litigant, you want to go to Loretto. You do not want Penn Central. If you're the government, you want to be in Penn Central land because that's where you win. There's always this sort of this tension between these two precedents. Now, Justice Blackmun has a couple good points. I'll get to the fire detector one in a minute. What does it mean to be permanent, right? How long must something be to be permanent, right? Obviously, nothing is going to be there forever. I think what the court says is under the law, so long as it's in effect, the cable must remain, and that's permanent enough for us. But when do you draw the line between temporary and permanent? It's actually a very hard question. The flooding litigation makes this point very clear. I don't have a good answer for you. We'll do another case later this semester called Cedar Point Nursery, which involves California law that required farmers to allow aid workers onto their property to help the organize unions and things of that nature. And they were allowed to come on for a certain number of hours, a certain number of days around the year. Was that permanent? And the court seemed to say that because this was this never-ending cycle, there was in fact a permanent occupation. So even here, the modern courts are shifting in that direction. You see? The book has a picture where they show what looks like a conduit where a cable comes down. I have no idea if it's active. I suspect they've probably been removed over the years because now we have fiber optic cables underground. So I can't imagine this is still active. You might still see the actual masonry, the conduits that are still there. It's very hard to remove. Yeah.
Let's talk about the Loretto and the Penn Central rule. If you're a litigant, you want to.
If you're the property owner, you want Loretto because of bright line rule. You do not want to deal with Penn Central. If you're the government, you always say, let's do Penn Central. We balance, we win. It's great. All right, everyone with me? All right, so now we get to the to the smoke detectors, right? So Justice Blackmun makes a fair point, which I think is not a particularly good response to. Landlord-tenant laws often require installation of many things. Examples might be utility connections, right? Mailboxes, smoke detectors, fire extinguishers. My favorite one is, see who's from New York. Why are there mirrors in elevators? That's like this one. Why you always use an elevator? Why is there a mirror in the elevator?
There was a TikTok. I saw a TikTok on this today. Literally, there's a question. The guy was talking about it, and he said that people don't like. It's not that they don't like long elevator rides. They don't like to be bored on elevators.
No.
So they put mirrors in the elevator.
No, that's not the reason. Ignore TikTok. It's a terrible Chinese communist propaganda. No, I'm kidding about that. I don't use TikTok. Anyone know? So you get mugged. So you don't get mugged when you walk into an elevator. There's a guy staying right here by the buttons. You don't see him. You get in, door closes, he robs you. Gets off the next floor. Call it the emergency stop. The mirror means you can see who's in the elevator. Yes. Oh, mugging's a bigger issue. Mugging's a bigger issue in New York, I guess. But yes, you don't get into an elevator in New York unless you see a mirror because you don't know who's there because they're hiding in the corner. So you can look at yourself so you don't get bored. Is that it? Is that what TikTok said?
What it said.
Oh God. I shouldn't have asked. It's fine.
Like a TEDx.
Okay, this person's never been to Brooklyn. Okay. I believe you. I believe you. He's never been to Brooklyn. Okay. I've been in those elevators where I'm scared of my mind to go for a few floors. It's not pleasant. Okay, you guys are good. But lots of things are installed with hammers and nails. And Justice Blackmun says, how do you distinguish these? Now maybe one answer is fire detectors, fire extinguishers, smoke detectors. These are health and safety measures, right? So maybe the government has a police power authority to install them, whereas cable TV is not. And that might sound like an attractive answer, but maybe I'll push back on my own answer for a bit. Cable TV was designed to promote the public welfare, right? Like public access television. Remember that stuff? Wayne's World, right? It was designed to give people a chance to share information before the internet. It was actually a very important public service. So if you start taking a more narrow conception of the police power, you start getting into trouble because the court doesn't like defining it. So I don't know that Justice Marshall has a good response, but maybe that people don't really object to smoke detectors, but they do object to these cable TV things. I don't know. Casey? Yeah. News, emergency alerts, and so on, right? No, I mean, there's definitely public value to having a cable TV line in your house. You watch the news, you see you become an informed citizen. That I think will be squarely within the police power. Anyone else want to? Zach, what are your thoughts on the fire extinguisher example, smoke alarm example?
I'm inclined to believe that the only distinguishing factor is whether anyone bitches about it.
Anyone what's about it?
Bitches about
Oh
it.
God, that's what I thought you said. I thought you said something else. I should have asked you to repeat it. How about complaints? Let's try to keep it PG in class. Okay. I don't know. Maybe I'm too much of. Yeah. Anyone complains about it, right? So no one's ever complained about the smoke detectors, but for whatever reason, they complained here. Now, why did they complain here? And the student in my other class had a good theory. Under the old deal, they got a cut of the revenue, right? They got a percentage of the revenue. Once New York enacted this law, that went out the door. You got $1 flat. So they lost that their cut. And so maybe they were complaining that, okay, no one's making profits off of a smoke detector, but you are making profits off of a cable TV line. And that might be one of the reasons why this case is different, why no one's complained about the smoke alarms and the smoke detectors. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. But you're basically requiring the installation of a commercial product in your building that you get no percentage of. So maybe that was the reason why. Today, virtually every building has a deal with either AT&T or Xfinity or whoever else. That's when you can't request a competitor, right? If you're in an apartment building, that's when you're using. And I'm pretty sure that the building gets some sort of revenue stream from Comcast or AT&T or Verizon, whoever the provider is. So now that's sort of taken care of. New York sidestepped that by just giving, okay, you get $1, that's it, go home.
Make these cable lines common carrier like electricity with money.
I mean, aren't they common carrier? I mean, they have to sell to anyone who signs up. I'm not sure what you mean.
In theory, but like you just said, if you're in an apartment complex that uses a spectrum, you can't.
Right, no, but that's different. That the building has a monopoly for the apartment dwelling. That's not a common carrier issue, right, son?
So this old cable system is basically the new cell tower thing. There's a bunch of cell towers up on buildings and stuff like that. They get like lifetime leases for them or 99 years for stuff like that.
You're interested in cell phone towers, aren't you? You ask about them a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually used to work at Verizon Wireless. I used to work at Verizon Wireless a decade ago, and a lot of this was some old when the 3G towers first went up. That's when I was working there. I'm dating myself. This is in 2003 or so. But yeah, a lot of these companies have these long-term leases to keep these towers in place, and they're not required to be interoperable. So they only provide service for their own company.
It's just a good like a revenue stream. Like if you have a strategic piece of plan that will come in with the infrastructure and stuff, but you really do sign away that piece.
Yeah, a lot of them, my favorite, are sort of disguised, where they'll have a cell phone that looks like a tree or a flagpole. They kind of disguise them to blend in with the environment. I don't know. I like that stuff. All right. So let me try to sort of bring the case to a conclusion. The court found that there was a taking. The court did not decide whether the $1 fee was just compensation. On remand, the New York court said, yes, the $1 compensation. Go home, Loretto, right? Go home and watch some TV, I suppose. On the cable lines you don't let your people have installed in your building. So all this was for absolutely nothing, right? I mean, at the end of all this litigation, Loretto wound up exactly where she was before, with $1 compensation, minus all of her attorney's fees. Right? So one of the sort of frustrating, I shouldn't say frustrating, but one of the more sort of annoying parts of takings litigation is when you get to the end of the road and you find that, okay, yes, there's a taking, but nothing will happen. The lawsuit is exactly the same. And that's commonly what happens. So litigating takings cases is actually very risky, right? You often get nothing to show for it, and it goes on forever. Anyway, so Loretto got nothing to show for it. Questions on Loretto? Yes.
I just did a quick thing of Google search. Y'all are both right on the elevator stuff.
Okay.
Okay.
Who's more right?
Well, I mean,
Who's right? The New York City answer.
one for safety, so you can see everything going on in the elevator. For handicapped people that are in wheelchairs, so that they can see whenever they come out.
Okay.
And then, like the depth of the mirror, so that people who are claustrophobic don't feel too bad in them.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good. TikTok prevails.
How beneficial.
Thank you for your Google search. All right. All right. Let me try to give you a little flow chart, if I can, which I think might create some clarity, but will probably just create more confusion. But I'll try. Takings cases often follow a very sort of regimented path. So let's just start here. So first, we ask ourselves, is there a permanent physical occupation under Loretto, right? Is there a permanent physical occupation under Loretto? Again, this is the third Penn Central factor, but you should probably start off with it, right? Because it turns out to be actually very significant. If the answer is yes, that means there's a taking and you must provide compensation. If there's a permanent physical occupation under Loretto, there's a taking and you must provide compensation. No balancing. You do not do any balancing with the Loretto test. It's a bright line, per se, rigid rule. Are those penny socks? What's his name? The clown from It? Pennywise, yeah. That's kind of creepy. Yeah. Sorry, I just noticed those. I can't remember his name. Pennywise, that's it. So yes. Okay, this is taking. All right. What if the answer is no? Okay, then we have to go to Penn Central land. All right. But do not forget nuisance. Under how to check, the government can use its police power to abate a nuisance. All right. So even if there's some sort of temporary physical invasion, something temporary, if there's a nuisance, the government can still regulate it under the police power. All right. And what if there's no nuisance? Then we go to Penn Central. And the most important factor is number 2, the DIBI, distinct investment-backed expectations. So this kind of inverts the Penn Central test, right? We don't really even look at the economic impact because it almost never matters, right? That's never enough. We ask first off, is there a permanent physical occupation? The answer is yes, there's a taking bright line rule. Compensation was provided. If not, we can think about Penn Central. And never forget how to check if there's a nuisance. If there's a nuisance, the government can abate it, no compensation required under the police power. And if there's no nuisance, then we get to the Penn Central balancing, and we ask ourselves, is there distinct investment-backed expectations? The answer is almost always no. Government is going to win. Okay. Does that flow chart make sense? It'll get worse next week, I promise. We add more cases, of course, about when something's permanent and so on. Okay. So yeah, let me sort of summarize. We've only done 4 cases in this topic, but they cover a lot of ground. So Penn Cole asks, does regulation go too far? Okay. How do we know if a regulation goes too far? We use the parcel as a whole strategy from the dissent. And that's what Penn Central tells us. And how do you know if the parcel as a whole is being regulated? We look at whether there's some sort of distinct investment-backed expectations that have been affected. But don't forget, under Loretto, there's a permanent physical occupation that requires compensation as a bright line rule. And always lurking in the background, ask yourself, is there a nuisance? Is there a nuisance? Now, a preview of the next case, you might ask yourself, what is a nuisance? Are these common law nuisances? Or are these nuisances that can be invented by the legislature? If the government decides that building on beachfront property is a nuisance, is that enough? Justice Scalia would say no. But these are common law nuisances. So I'm just giving you a preview. This flow chart expands as we go through it. Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
What's the DIB?
Distinct investment-backed expectations. You're welcome. Everyone got that? DIBs, distinct investment-backed expectations. This was the second factor that Justice Brennan discussed in the Penn Central case. Yeah.
Like I made the determined, but all just like stack up on each other. Pretty much big again.
I'll get there. I know. I get this question every year. It's gonna be ugly. I'm sorry. It's not. This flow chart might look a little clean now. It's gonna be like future interest. It's gonna be all over the place. And the short answer, and I'll just tell you this now, is that there's not a single right way of approaching one of these questions for the exam. You sometimes have to sort of stumble through it, especially after some more of the recent cases. There's a lot of different tests you have to learn, unfortunately. The Supreme Court completely botched this area of the law. It's just completely a mess. I blame Holmes. I blame Brennan. It's all their fault. But my poor law students have to suffer through it every semester. I'm sorry. I do the best I can. I try. I don't have TikTok. I don't use TikTok, but oh, good Lord help you. Stay off TikTok for property. All right. Anything else? All right. Again, no class Thursday. I'll see you next Tuesday. Have a good Passover, a good Ramadan, a good Easter, and I'll see you all soon. What about it? What about